Awesome. Perfect. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for attending today's session on environmental justice and liberation science. My name is Luz Guel, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Environmental Justice at the Department of Environmental Medicine and Public Health at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. With me today is also Dr. Don Robert Semple, who will be co-moderating this panel with me. It is a pleasure, Don, to be able to co-moderate this panel with you. The speakers from this session are activists, facilitators, organizers, scientists, who will all share approaches, strategies, stories, perspectives, and visions for how we can organize within and outside of academia to address the root causes of environmental and climate injustices and build towards collective liberation. Liberation science challenges the traditional anti-Black, imperialistic, capitalistic, patriarchal, and white supremacist approaches to science in order to solve environmental and climate injustices. This commitment is central to the need to expose and understand how systems of domination inform our current environmental justice struggles, and thus develop alternative paths of resistance rooted in liberation. Liberation is a daily practice and a commitment to a radical transformation of ourselves, our communities, structures, systems, and to justice and to love. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Don, who will be getting started with intros for all of our speakers today.
Thank you, Luz, and thank you all for being here today. Let's begin with some introductions, of course. So please tell us about yourself, about your work in brief, and how it's related to the theme of this session, environmental justice and liberation science. Jessica, can you start us off, please?
Yes, so Bundeo Pabiuchi. I'm Jessica Hernandez, and I'm an Indigenous scientist located at the University of Washington. And my work kind of focuses on energy justice at the moment. But as I will dive into my presentation, energy justice is a component of environmental justice. And I'm happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Kendra, would you like to go next?
Hi there, my name is Kendra Krueger. I'm zooming in right now from New York City and occupied Lanai Lenape territory. I am the STEM Education and Outreach Manager at CUNY's Advanced Science Research Center, where I run a program called the Community Sensor Lab, where we're building do-it-yourself environmental sensors to monitor in different local communities, air quality, and also flooding. And we're really trying to create more accessibility to sensing and data across the city.
Thank you so much, Kendra. Natalie, would you like to go next?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Hernandez Barahona, and I am a first-generation Chicana. I'm a community organizer for the mutual aid grassroots organization called Yuma County Abolition. We're dedicated to bringing autonomy, abolition, education, resources, decolonization, environmental justice, and intersectionality to the Yuma County, Arizona community. I also do work with a nonprofit called Arizona-California Humanitarian Coalition, where we provide migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border with their most immediate needs.
Great. And Carla.
Good morning. I'm Carla Sanchez, she, her, ella. I'm a coordinator at Direct Network of Arizona, and I'm also a volunteer for Hospice of Yuma and the Arizona-California Humanitarian Coalition. I'm also part of YCA. It's a grassroots frontline, a community organization. And our main core mission is creating a space that fosters community-based action, ensuring support and justice to our community, restoring our vital relationships to Pachamama, to each other, and to ourselves.
Excellent.
And so Jorge should be hopefully joining us later today, but in the meantime, we're actually going to go ahead and jump to the presentation. So Jessica, now you can take it away and be able to share your screen and start us off with today's panel. So take it away.
Okay, thank you. I'll be sharing my screen. So today, as the panel is entitled, is Environmental Justice and Liberation Science. And I'm Jessica Hernandez again. So before I begin this presentation, I would like to virtually acknowledge the lands where I'm virtually presenting from. Today, I'm virtually presenting from the ancestral lands of the Caddo and Kappa Nations, also known as Little Rock, Arkansas. So who am I? I'm an Indigenous scientist, as I mentioned earlier. I also come from a matriarchal society, meaning that our women and two-spirited relatives have the autonomy and the leadership in our communities. We're one of the only remaining matriarchal societies among Indigenous communities. I'm also an author and community advocate. So a lot of my work is not necessarily stationed in academic settings. It's also kind of focusing on community mutual aid and community outreach as well. So I always like to ask this question to the audience, especially given my positionality as an Indigenous person, given this presentation. So can one Indigenous person speak for all Indigenous peoples? So mentally answer yes, no, or not sure. Take the next 5 seconds to answer this question. So as we know, no. So one Indigenous person cannot speak for all Indigenous peoples. And I think that it's important for me to mention that, given that I am an Indigenous woman speaking on Indigenous environmental justice issues today. So this is because as Indigenous peoples, we are all different. We have intersectionalities. Our indigeneity is place-based, meaning that depending on the location of our ancestral homelands and where we're raised, our identities are different, and we are different as people, even within our own tribes, nations, and pueblos. So for me, how do I define environmental justice? So I define it as a community-led movement that addresses the systematic barriers and inequities that communities of color face when it comes to environmental impacts. And I think that it's important, especially as we use language, to allow our communities to define and drive these movements and this terminology, given that today we're focusing on environmental justice. So for most of my Indigenous communities and most of Indigenous communities, we have this holistic worldview of our environments. Therefore, for us, environmental justice is also interconnected to climate justice, to energy justice, food justice. They're all pillars that kind of are achieving and moving towards racial justice, land liberation, and people liberation as well. So as an Indigenous person, one of the first principles and lessons that I was, learned as a child was that nature protects us as long as we protect nature. And I think that as Indigenous peoples, this teaching plays a big role in our communities, given that we have a spiritual connection. So we're also a part of nature. So a lot of our creation stories kind of derive from the fact that our gods and goddesses and deities created us from the natural elements of our communities. And as a result of that, right, we don't see ourselves separated from animals or plants or even the abiotic factors, the non-living organisms that are derived in our communities. We see how in a traditional clothing or regalia, we're also embodying our natural elements as we embroider many of our native flowers, plants, and also our animals, and we use our natural elements to do that. Obviously, these connections to our environments and in spirits and our creation stories are all different, as I mentioned, because our identities are place-based. So depending on the Indigenous community you come from, these will all differ. And I think that it's important for us to also bring colonization into the dialogue, especially given that a lot of the environmental injustices that Indigenous peoples face is a result of, colonization and colonial systems that still operate in today's society. So one of the things that colonization introduced is this pristine myth, right, where our nature is pure wilderness and unspoiled. So when colonists and colonizers came into the Americas, and it started within Latin America, to be particular, the Caribbean, they saw this pure wilderness, unspoiled nature. And as a result, this was kind of erasing and also ignoring the fact that many Indigenous communities that were living here since time immemorial were actually caretaking and stewarding this land. So these lands were not necessarily, as colonizers kind of depicted, pure wilderness and unspoiled, given that there was this strong human and nature relationship that our ancestors kind of coexisted and kind of cultivated as we were living here. There's also this introduction of the ecological noble savage, where stereotype, it's a stereotype that basically says that how Indigenous peoples were portrayed during colonization, where we are these kind of mystical creatures that are really in tune with nature. And I think that, today, even in our panel, we will discuss how displacement is impacting Indigenous people. So we also have to keep in mind that, the ecological noble savage is a stereotype because not every Indigenous person has a strong relationship with their ancestral lands, given that displacement is also occurring as we speak today, especially from the global south. And as an Indigenous scientist, like I introduced myself, I think that I have to follow this balancing act because, I sometimes I am the only Indigenous person in many of the spaces that I occupy, especially given that, my credentials give me more power in terms of, I had hold a PhD, where I have to balance and make sure that I don't amplify the stereotype of the ecological noble savage, where people assume that, if you're Indigenous, you're automatically have this strong relationship with nature. And I think that's also important to keep that in mind. And obviously that balancing act is still hard to achieve at times. So one of the things that, we see how colonization impacted us when it first started and continues to impact us. We also see that as Indigenous peoples, we're often ignored, silenced, and excluded from climate change policy, environmental policy that ultimately determines environmental justice approaches, right? So when we talk about environmental justice from the government or policy lens, Indigenous voices are never to be found. And as that interconnection that I made between environmental justice and climate justice, it's also important to talk about how climate change is also manifesting a lot of the environmental injustices and climate injustices we're facing today. So as we know, scientific data has proven that the global average temperature, starting from 1850 to today, is continuing to rapidly increase. So that's like scientific evidence that, obviously there is a debate that climate change doesn't exist, especially in this political spectrum, but, scientific data points to otherwise. And as a result of that, we see how climate change and Indigenous peoples are resulting in inequities. And these 5 main inequities have been identified. The first one is that degree of responsibility for climate change. So despite Indigenous communities not being responsible for, creating climate change and these conditions, we have the strongest and the most largest responsibility to kind of, continue, especially as we think about the 7 generations. The inequity number 2 is the impact of climate change in the global south. So we know that a lot of global south communities, especially when we talk about Latin America, 50% of the world's biodiversity is currently located in Latin America. Yet because, the global north and also, first world countries or global dominant countries like the United States, Canada, they're the ones resulting and increasing the greenhouse gas impacts that we're seeing today. So we're unfortunately, drastically impacting the global south, especially Latin America and other countries where we have a large Indigenous community and populations. Inequity number 3 is the ability and capacity to deal with the impacts of climate change. So even today in the panel, we're going to be discussing how this also impacts Black and Indigenous peoples because, we don't have the necessary tools from the government, right? Especially given the responsibility that they should actually hold to kind of deal with the impacts of climate change. So we're seeing how there's a lot of community-driven solutions because, we're not just going to sit there and let these impacts kind of drastically marginalize us, right? But we see how there's more efforts and more responsibilities that we have to take because we don't have the capacity or ability to deal with these issues. Inequity number 4 is the intergenerational impacts of climate change. And I think that we can tie that back to displacement, where a lot of Indigenous communities are being displaced, whether it be internal displacement, where they're displaced from, within their borders, the settler borders that were created. For instance, many Indigenous communities are displaced from their rural areas to cities because of climate change. And we also have external displacement, which is across borders. And inequity number 5 is the gender disparities of climate change. So we see how Indigenous women and Indigenous two-spirited folks actually have the biggest impacts of climate change, but yet, those gender disparities are not necessarily uplifted in the climate change and environmental discourse. So we know that DESA has, defined that Indigenous peoples and the role they play in combating climate change are really considered in public discourses on climate change. So we're going back to that policy component where despite we're facing all these inequities that are being identified within international forums, there's still no inclusion of Indigenous peoples today in that discourse. So when I think about liberation science, especially as somebody who has been trained within the Western sciences, to be specific, oceanography, forestry, soil sciences, and even physics, because climate science comes a lot from physics, I look at the integration of Indigenous science. So for me, liberation science is also including other ways of knowing that are not necessarily in a way validated by Western credentials or these Western educational systems. So Indigenous science, we see how Indigenous worldviews or the ways that we view our environments and nature are often dismissed in environmental discourse. And we also see how Indigenous peoples are seen as research subjects or areas of expertise rather than experts themselves. So we see this in the government sector, in nonprofits, and also in academia, where Indigenous peoples, there's this kind of willingness to kind of use them as research subjects and areas of expertise rather than bringing in Indigenous peoples because they're the experts themselves as well. So I think that, being trained in the Western sciences, there's this notion of two-eye seeing, which I think is derived from the First Nations in Canada, Indigenous peoples from Canada, where you look at that world from two lenses. And one is the Western knowledge and ways of knowing, and the other one is Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing. So Indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous knowledge is what I refer to as a science, because I think that being trained in the Western sciences, I see how Indigenous knowledge is also a science because it has been formulated since time immemorial through generations, through observations. And while we don't have those conclusions, right, as the Western sciences follow, we do have a lot of knowledge that's still formulating today because we're seeing how climate change is impacting our environments as well. And I think that, this is a beautiful depiction of how our perspectives as Indigenous peoples differs from the Western way of life, which is colonization, right? Where colonization kind of came to extract a lot from our natural resources, where, it focused more on capitalistic gains. And as a result of that, right, we depend heavily on oils and other fossil fuels, versus Indigenous ways of life is kind of more of healing our environment, looking at trying to see, because we know we're not going to reverse our environments back to how they were when our ancestors were taking care of that, because colonization has also resulted in long impacts to our environments, but we see that more as a healing component. So I think that for me, environmental justice and liberation science is a way that we can heal our environments. And of course, since we're interconnected to our environments, it's also a way for healing ourselves as well. And going back to Western science, right, we see how Western science follows the scientific method where it's very linear, binary, and the founders of many of the science disciplines are given credit to white European men, right? So we even see how there's this gender exclusion and how there's, this exclusion from the global south, especially given that there's a large population of Indigenous communities there, where, it's white men who are given basically the credit for founding these sciences, even though we have a lot of knowledge to hold. And looking back, to give you a visual of what Indigenous science is more holistic, right? Because we do not separate ourselves from the science that we're practicing. And there's also this center component that basically depicts the human and nature relationship, right? So we can see there at the spiritual core that basically is not spirituality as it's defined in Western religion, but more of the spirituality that we know that all of our relations, that we're all interconnected with our non-living and living species, whether they're non-human as well. So I think that moving forward, especially as we talk about environmental justice and liberation, science is, to ask ourselves, how can we integrate Indigenous science in environmental justice work, projects, and our research? And I think that that's something to think about and also reflect as we continue this panel, but also to kind of do the work, especially we're coming from environmental organizations or academic settings where there is no inclusion of Indigenous science moving forward. And I think that's also important to mention that Indigenous science cannot be integrated without Indigenous peoples, right? Because oftentimes we package these areas of expertise into boxes where we think that we can just check a box or we can actually learn it from a textbook and then become experts. And I think that's important to basically mention that Indigenous science cannot be integrated without Indigenous peoples. And I think that many environmental justice advocates and scientists help to unlearn how they treat Indigenous peoples, because, we continue to be seen as research subjects in areas of expertise. And I think that's all for my short presentation. Thank you for listening.
That was amazing, Jessica. Kendra, you're up next.
Thank you. Yes, that was awesome, Jessica. I'm so stoked to be in this conversation with all these folks. Let me pull up my screen. Okay, you see it full screen right now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So my name is Kendra Krueger again, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about love and science, because for me, I think liberation science is a lot about finding ourselves within the work of science and entering ourselves into the equations that we're looking at. I'm just going to jump right in by starting to talk a little bit about myself as part of that story. So I grew up in New York City in the Lower East Side and am the daughter of two artists. So was really brought up with a lot of these ideals of self-expression and self-exploration, but also in building community and having a role to play in our own communities. So that's always been kind of a big driver in looking for what is my role in community and how is the work that I'm doing affecting the people around me. So grew up in that kind of environment, but was always sort of naturally curious about everything happening in the world and the universe around me, and was a bit of an inventor. So eventually got into science and went into engineering for school through a great after-school program that I was part of here in New York City at the Museum of Natural History. Eventually went to college for electrical engineering and was really into astronomy and astrophysics. I actually worked for a short period of time at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory out in New Mexico. So I was basically like Jodie Foster out there talking to the aliens. But then I went back to school and got really into microelectronics and was really fascinated by the interactions of electrons and photons and different materials and semiconductor materials and how these energy transfers were happening. So decided to go to grad school for nanotechnology. So ended up getting really into optics and nanostructures. But it was here in grad school that I started to have more existential questions about how all of these different concepts of physics and technology were actually helping society, or even like helping me internally in my own like personal development process. And I didn't really know what to do with it then. I was in a PhD program, but couldn't really find a place to grow these questions. So ended up leaving school, working in the photonics industry. I was doing some more like nanotechnology, building different optical devices for cameras. But I then, in my free time, started to get more involved in the arts again, and actually started to do more dance and theater, and had this great opportunity to work with a great friend of mine, Cabrina Josefina de Jesus, who was working on her MFA at the time in building community practice through the arts and through identity exploration. And I'd never really done a deeper dive into my own identity as a mixed race person. And we created this whole ensemble piece that was based on our lineage and our history, using music and dance. And it was so internally transformative, and also utilized such a process that was similar to science in terms of observation and inquiry and asking questions and developing experiments, that I started to think like, what would it look like if we could do these kinds of internal explorations simultaneously with our external explorations in the way that we explore the world outside of ourselves? And can these two kind of systems come together? So I ended up leaving my job and deciding that I was going to figure out how to create sort of a framework that bridged both these internal and external worlds, but also our like intuitive problem solving skills and our analytical problem solving skills too. So through that, I started to develop this kind of personal philosophy and pedagogy, this teaching philosophy that was based on definitely a lot of Western science, because I'm super fascinated with physics, engineering, astronomy, technology, but also growing up in this artistic space and still being a part of the theater and the somatic learning world. I think that there's so much knowledge that exists within our own bodies and are ways that we can process information and do analysis in those sorts of ways. I got really into regenerative design as well. I studied permaculture, which is really just repackaged indigenous knowledge, also known as agroecology and social ecology, which really led me into more social justice movements. I got trained in a lot of anti-oppression facilitation, popular education, and pedagogy of the oppressed, which comes out of Brazil and Paulo Freire's work, that basically, we all have innate knowledge within us. And it's just how do we as educators activate that knowledge and activate these ways of thinking critically and consciously in our society and finding our roles and our voices in that way. And Bell Hooks also talks a lot about this in her books, and specifically in Teaching to Transgress. And additionally, I integrate a lot of mindfulness. I've been trained in the Shambhala tradition, which is all about kind of the spiritual path of the warrior, of like how we all have this sort of like basic goodness within us and that exists in nature, and practices of meditation and connecting on these deeper spiritual levels as well. And then getting involved in more of my own ancestral knowledge practices and learning with others in my community. I kind of skipped the step where when I went to graduate school, I had moved to Colorado. And so I was living in Colorado and connecting with a lot of these ancestral lineage practices that were emerging in the space around herbalism and healing, and also urban farming and gardening that we were doing out there. So I really try to integrate kind of all of these different ideas together, and started to teach in different community spaces on this sort of like philosophical level. Like, how do we start to look at science from these different angles, and that many of these patterns that exist, whether they be in our scientific way of thinking or in our social way of thinking, are different types of like archetypes or patterns. So for example, I did some talks about looking at the phenomenon of light being both a particle and a wave is sort of similar to how we're exploring different aspects of race and gender and identity, how sometimes we want to be more solid, we want to be more defined, and sometimes we want to be more amorphous. Sometimes we can't be defined within those limits. And how do we use these kind of ideas and these patterns to explore in different spaces and be inspired, whether they be inspiring us from inside out into the way that we understand our external world, or vice versa, looking at the external world and the patterns that exist as a means to understand ourselves or our relationships to one another. I'm really fascinated by thermodynamics and exchanges of energy in different systems, particularly entropy, as well as this idea that we're always sort of fighting against chaos or things like descending into less and less control, but actually like chaos gives us more opportunities. And that's, again, sort of another Western way of thinking, that when there's more uncertainty, we have less power, less control, and therefore should be more fearful. But really, are there ways that we can move into spaces where there's more uncertainty and be more creative in those spaces, because there's more possibilities, there's more diversity of situations that can emerge in those spaces. So started to teach a lot about this kind of theory and philosophy, which is, I really encapsulate as sort of moving beyond reductionism. So this idea that I think really emerged out of Western and Eurocentric science and thinking is a sort of divide and conquer model that we know that replicates in colonialism, which really is connected to reductionism, this idea of separating or isolating something as much as possible in order to understand and control it and open it up and look at it. But when you do so, you separate it from the natural environment that it exists in. And so you can't see the ways that it really exists in a more dynamic system. And this aspect of colonialism and divide and conquer and reductionism, it's not only like in an experimental setting separating the test subject from the environment, but it also separates us from nature, from one another, from ourselves. And this is an idea that really came out of conversations with a great friend of mine, Eutimia Montoya Cruz, who is a Chicana lineage holder and healer and scholar in Colorado. And these concepts, what happens is if we get so used to breaking things into smaller and smaller boxes, we don't understand, we can't see the full picture, the whole. And now we're understanding that things are more interconnected, more interdependent, but we don't have so many systems or tools to analyze or understand those kinds of systems. We only have these tools that break things into smaller and smaller boxes. So they're starting to be more emergent processes of doing systems thinking, relational thinking, looking in order to look at these complex systems. But I think where a lot of the tools are going to lie are within more of these intuitive practices that come out of more of our ancestral, our indigenous wisdoms, that and also our subconscious and our emotional spaces that do sort of naturally know, or as we're trying to figure out and experiment with, dealing with more complex systems and relations and people and ourselves, and the way that our body also knows how to deal with the complexities of it too. So a lot of this was all a lot of, I spent many years really developing and thinking about this in a theoretical way and talking about it in a really theoretical way. And I kind of did things in separate boxes. I worked as a scientist and I worked as a community organizer and started to teach these workshops, but didn't get to the point of doing like the science. How do you do science in a more liberated way, or including more of these philosophies into it? But sure enough, life comes knocking and reality checks happen. And in my path of just sort of like starting to go on the circuit of doing more lectures and talking and teaching as a professor about these things, and thinking I was having a lot more success with it, suddenly like family crises happened. I had to come home. I had to move back to New York. Other things, things start to fall apart. And I needed to get more of a stable job. I needed to find financial security. And I think that was sort of the impetus to be like, okay, now it's time to like integrate this into more of a practice, and figuring out how to stay with it and how to figure it out in a concrete way. Because what I had to do, as I needed to find a job, I at that point, was at such a position where I thought, I just was trying to get a job at a supermarket. But luckily, I tried to just follow the breadcrumbs and found a job at the CUNY's, the City University of New York Advanced Science Research Center. They were just opening a new education center at their location up in Harlem. And the advanced science, I was really lucky to find this institution because it's a fairly new research space, connected to the City University of New York, and their focus is all about doing interdisciplinary research. So really moving beyond, again, the reductionist approach of breaking things into just chemistry, physics, biology, but seeing the interconnections between all of these different disciplines. Sorry. So I love CUNY because it's a public institution as well. We're one of the largest public urban universities, I think, like in the country, if not the world. And we have a super diverse student body as well. So I really love working with the students. And again, I came in here just as a coordinator at first, running youth field trips in this education center. But what it was really an opportunity to start to think about and talk about these ideas in kind of a more subversive way. As education, I really see education as a means of subversion in so many ways, and ways to spread these ideals through the minds of young people, but also through the scientists that work in this space, because I was able to do trainings with scientists and talk about these philosophies and talk about these ideas with them in a way that was motivated through engaging with young people and engaging with community spaces, community members as well. But it became more of this incubator space and play space for us to really think about how we can do this in a practice way. So what started to evolve out of that is a program we started called the Community Sensor Lab, where I worked with one scientist in our environmental science initiative to develop he was already working on developing these low cost sensors that can be deployed, in different community spaces. And what I helped to do is develop a model that utilize it as an educational tool too. So we developed a whole curriculum and a kind of almost like a mutual aid centered program where we connected with different community organizations to teach young people at their organizations how to build these sensors and then empower them to teach other people. So we developed a whole train the trainer model. So these sensors that you see here, these are some of our air quality sensors. Then they measure carbon dioxide, pressure, temperature, humidity, and particulate matter. So carbon dioxide being a greenhouse gas and particulate matter being important to understand how things like black carbon and exhaust that's coming out of burning other fossil fuels can really affect our lungs. So that's particulate matter, that's PM 2.5. That's a important measurement to have. So we're entering into the second summer of our program, and we really try to influence a lot of skill building, where we're not only training students and young people, but also older individuals who live in their communities who are interested in learning about circuits. And we learn about, they're based on Arduino platforms, so we learn about coding as well, and environmental science, and also how to speak about this information, how to build your own curriculum around these sensors and to teach it in your own community. So just yesterday, we had a pop-up. There's a new program in New York City called Open Streets, where they close down different streets and neighborhoods. And we have been working with one community now for 2 years called Red Hook out in Brooklyn that has one of the largest public housing communities in New York City and is particularly vulnerable to air quality. They're susceptible to air quality, the air quality environment, because there is an Amazon warehouse that's being built there right now. That's going to be a last mile facility where basically, that's the last drop off spot to distribute the goods and from 1 mile from there. So there's going to be a lot of trucking happening in the neighborhood, but just in general, it's a neighborhood that's been really under-resourced. So we've been working with community members there who have come and trained in our lab this summer, along with our undergraduate students and also other non-traditional students and young folks who are part of a workforce development program. So we learned about circuits, and then yesterday they were teaching other community members how to build these sensors and about the science behind them. But, it's still just on this. I bring this up and kind of the element of Donna Haraway staying with the trouble. It's still a struggle. What I wanted to highlight is, working back in an academic environment, and again, trying to bring all of these more theoretical ideas of what does liberation science mean? What does it mean to bring like a heart-centered approach to the work that we do? What does it mean to bring all of these different elements and try to create a program where you're meeting so many different goals? We're trying to do something that's technical and has data and have students learn skills so that they can get jobs, they can be a part of the workforce, but at the same time, like, have a transformational experience, be able to build relationships with one another, build relationships with others. And it's still a struggle. Like, I feel like, oscillate back and forth between becoming just like the straight academic, or being, just sort of like a sappy emotional person and just like wanting us to hang out and be friendly with another. Because I think there's also a lot of like, you get, when you work in these kind of in an academic environments, but you want to be more transformational, you can get amnesia, I feel like, and forget like how to bring that heart-centered, because you're always sort of pushed in the opposite direction. So try to be technical and publishable and objective and rational. And so it's a constant sort of like coming back and remembering, and a building of and a need to continue to build that capacity for love in systems of complexity and bravery, because even just saying love in those kind of spaces can be contemptuous sometimes. And so I'm finding that we just have to continue to explore how to integrate where we're at right now and where we want to go. And it's this really ebb and flow of finding the balance between the two, but always sort of like trying to push forward. And so just to sort of like encapsulate it, that, you know, liberation science for me is trying to explore these ways where we can integrate our ways of exploring the external and the internal world, but doing so also in a way where we're building relationships and community and spreading the ideas of science, and also including new ways of thinking about science in the process too. So thank you for letting me speak, and that's the end of my talk. Did I stop sharing?
That was beautiful, Kendra. Thank you so much for reminding us to talk about love and making it a heart-centered approach when it comes to our work. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Nat and Carla, who are also going to talk a lot about love and how that is also infused into a lot of the work that they do. So Nat and Carla, take it away.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, thank you so much. Let me get this screen shared. Can everyone see?
Yeah, we're good. We can see it.
Okay.
Awesome. All right. Well, first of all, I wanted to start by saying thank you for allowing us to be a part of this amazing panel. We are very grateful. I'm Carla Sanchez, and thank you everyone for attending this presentation. So me and Nat are part of a group named Yuma County Abolition. We are based out of Yuma, Arizona, a border town located in the Sonoran Desert, occupying Quapa and Quetzal land. During the summer of 2020, in the midst of a global pandemic that has disproportionately affected our Black and Brown communities, a group of like-minded individuals decided it was time Yuma County tackled the hard conversations and think critically about racism, colonialism, and imperialism, all rooted in white supremacy. I have a daughter, so as a mother, I feel all this is essential, and I'm very grateful to have been able to create a space like this alongside like-minded individuals. YCA works allow a much-needed possibility for a world where our children and all of us can thrive as a community for the betterment of all beings. Our mission statement is, we are one cosmic body, transborder group of community-based abolitionists. We are committed to the liberation of oppressed people of the world through education, decolonization, and founding value ternura radical. We are committed to collective healing. We believe that every human, every life form inherently deserves a dignified life. We are committed to creating spaces for our community to learn about our roots and past, to know where we are going. We are forging our path forward for the 7th generation. Who we are as YCA and what we stand for is, we are dedicated to bringing autonomy, abolition, education and resources, decolonization, environmental justice, and intersectionality to the Yuma County, Arizona community. Our founding value is ternura radical, which translates to radical tenderness. And I'd like to read an excerpt from Radical Tenderness Is, a living manifesto by Danny D'Amelia and Daniel B. Chavez that resonates with YCA. Radical tenderness is to be critical and loving at the same time. Radical tenderness is to understand how to use strength as a caress. Radical tenderness is to know how to accompany one another among friends and lovers at different distances and speeds. Radical tenderness is writing this text at the same time from 2 faraway continents, from the same bed, writing whilst caressing. Radical tenderness is to know to say no, is to carry the weight of another body as if it were your own, is to share sweat with a stranger. Radical tenderness is to dance among the dissident bodies in a workshop, to be completely overwhelmed and maintain our smiles and celebrations. Radical tenderness is to allow yourself to be seen, to allow yourself to be taken. Radical tenderness is to give a narcissist the option of adapting or rethinking their position. Radical tenderness is to embrace thorns. Radical tenderness is to exist with lack. is to face things head on by looking at them from the love of wanting to be seen. Abolition is the action or an act of abolishing a system, practice, or institution. As Yuma County Abolition, all of our community work is based on abolition. We truly believe the safest communities don't have the most law enforcement. They have the most resources. Together, we are working towards destroying borders and building bridges, and believe abolition is the future. As Mariam Kaba says, abolition is a collective vision. Aprendiendo de nuestra raíz y pasado para saber hacia dónde vamos. Learning from our roots and past to know where we are going. The task of decolonization belongs to all of us. I think we can all ask ourselves, how is our relationship to the land, to indigenous territories that invaders have wrongfully seized, redefined, and used for new purposes? Part of our collective responsibility is to readjust our perception of decolonization. We must shift from a view of judgment to a method of action whereby fundamental economic systems are transformed to systems of equity. Instead of accepting blame, it invites us to assume responsibility. With no decolonization, there is no revolution. So something we do YCA in our community is we hold book club meetings, and we get together once a month. We are currently reading We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice by Mariam Kaba. And we believe that through cinema and reading, we initiate critical, political, and educational conversations in our community about what is happening in the world, about our history, and about the future of our people. Another project aside from book club is popular cinema, Cine Popular, where we share movies and invite the community to watch with us. We've organized several outdoor events in the community, sharing food, tamales, hot chocolate, coffee, and we hold very important conversations. And we've had a few virtual movie events as well. Here's some of the films we've presented. We've had 13th, the film by Ava DuVernay that explores the history of racial inequality in the United States. We've done Trouble the Water, a story of Scott and Kimberly Rivers' survival story through Hurricane Katrina. See that Hurricane Katrina? And the PBS Native American, a documentary exploring the world of America's first people.
We do daily border aid runs. These runs consist of stocking highly trafficked sites along the Colorado River with water, food, and snacks. We also provide other essentials such as hygiene products, diapers, blankets, and dry, clean clothes. During these runs have made us realize that there's a preventable disaster. Thousands of migrants were forced to leave behind their personal belongings by Border Patrol. Daily, we find photos, shoes, backpacks, clothing, religious items, including files and passports that could prove crucial in processing claims. We are concerned about not only the lack of autonomy and respect these migrants face, but also the negative environmental impacts these practices from Border Patrol are causing. Most of those arriving to seek asylum in our section of the border are from Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, Romania, India, and other Eastern European countries. We know that the main reason people leave home and seek asylum in another country is when violence against civilians and political instability or climate crisis in their home countries reach unbearable levels. We are not here to be judge and jury for these migrants. We want to create a welcoming experience for these migrants during their journey. Migration has been happening for thousands of years. Migration is natural, and migration is beautiful. Here we see some supplies we've taken to the border. In this photo to the left, we set up a food station to offer a hot meal. The safest way to provide nourishment is for us to give single-serve containers, which creates trash, but then we pick up the trash. In the photo to the right, we have one of our volunteers looking in a dumpster after we noticed some supplies were from the border were being taken and tossed into the dumpsters. Religious items that migrants are forced to leave behind. Land restoration is a big part of what we do at the border. We want the land to remain clean for the migrants, to have a clean space for the flourishing biodiversity in the area to not be dismayed. Some of the items that migrants are forced to leave behind are washed and donated to shelters. Most importantly, we provide human interactions. We provide a friendly face, listening ears, a helping hand, and a heartfelt welcome. Here we see a couple of photos of some of our wonderful volunteers. To the right, you can see one of the few dumpsters we have at the border filled with migrants' personal belongings. In the photo to the left, we see a note made by a daughter to her father. She unfortunately was forced to leave the note behind. The photo to the right was one of the nights we had to make multiple trips to the border to make sure everyone had access to food and water. Migrants were left waiting for 3 days in the Yuma heat in the middle of summer. Here we see a wheelchair that a person migrating was forced to leave behind at the border by Border Patrol. These practices are inhumane, and I often wonder how difficult this person's journey was after having to leave their wheelchair behind. Migrants are also forced to leave behind their shoes. We would not be able to do what we do without all the wonderful and hardworking volunteers that we have. During the winter, there would be fires made to keep warm from the cold desert nights. We would put those out and clean up any debris left. This prevented bushfires from potentially happening. When it comes to environmental justice, we believe an intersectional approach to environmental policy is necessary if we are to protect both people and Pachamama. It is important to address a statistical fact. People who live, work, and play in America's most polluted environments are commonly people of color and the poor. In 2020, Honduras had just gone through 2 disastrous hurricanes named Eta and Iota. We did a 2-day online event called ¿Qué pasa con the climate?, which translates to What is going on with the climate?, where we held a conversation about climate change, capitalism, and the current state of Honduras. During this event, we showed the movie named Trouble the Water, which is a film about a young couple surviving Hurricane Katrina in a community abandoned long before the hurricane hit, New Orleans. We then spoke about the parallels of the situation and how climate change affects all of us, but Black, brown, and poor communities the most. Along with the ¿Qué pasa con the climate event, YCA organized a Solidarity with Honduras mutual aid drive, where we raised funds for multiple shelters in Honduras. We were informed that most of the funds we raised went to mental health resources for the children. In 2021, a monsoon storm ravaged Gila Bend, Arizona, causing historic flooding, leaving many without homes, leading to power outages and damages to roadways and drainage systems. Yuma County Abolition was quick to respond with the mutual aid drive. We believe solidarity is the strength and tenderness of the people. Yuma County Abolition is against all border walls. In 2020, border wall construction made its way to unceded land, Quito Vaquito Springs. We received a call to action from our Indigenous Oram relatives that our support was needed for direct action against the building of the racist monument and protection of the water. We answered. We were praying and peacefully protesting, and we were met with tear gas and rubber bullets by state troopers and by park rangers that day. Community health means caring for ourselves and our peers. Caring for ourselves is not self-indulgent, it is self-preservation, and that in and of itself is an act of political warfare. Collective care is self-care. Joy is political. YCA has intended and promotes harm reduction training in overdose prevention, naloxone, Narcan training, fentanyl test strips training, safe syringe access and disposal training, and harm reduction means respect, dignity, and compassion. We believe harm reduction works and saves lives. Autonomy is defined by the right or condition of self-government. Through that value, YCA has organized bodily autonomy marches bail funds, and we're currently jumpstarting Yuma's first abortion fund. This past July, during a demonstration for reproductive justice rights, 2 protesters were arrested. We quickly started a mutual aid bail fund. Today is actually the last day to enter the raffle, valued at over $400. Any funds that go over our goal will be placed into Yuma's first abortion fund. YCA continuously supports our Indigenous brothers and sisters. We take part of multiple rallies, including Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women rallies, Indigenous Peoples Day month, and events to support Cuapa and Quetzal territories in our area. Here we have a flyer for a mutual aid raffle we did to support Lakota and Oram territories. These funds were raised to help with legal fees regarding the arrests made at Quito Vaquito Springs, and to Mama Jules, who works with Mothers Against Meth Alliance in South Dakota. Solidarity and intersectionality are an integral part of the work we do. We believe that we're not free until everyone is free. From Yuma to Palestine, our struggles are connected. We will continue to fight for a free Palestine. Here we have a flyer that we made for the end of Israeli apartheid, solidarity with Palestine from Yuma, Arizona. We participate in binational events, including a binational May Day action for our International Workers' Day with our comrades in Los Angeles. We had an open dialogue about the border and the struggles of the proletariat. That one's always a hard word for me. We come back to the summer of 2020, where many took to the streets in Yuma to protest the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. If one falls, we all fall. If one rises, we all rise. Summer 2020 is when Yuma County Abolition got together and with like-minded folks, and we started this project. Tú eres mi otro yo. Si te hago daño a ti, me hago daño a mí mismo. Si te amo y respeto, me amo y me respeto yo. You are my other self. If I hurt you, I hurt myself. If I love and respect you, I love and respect myself. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you all so much for the wonderful presentations. You're all truly embodying what it means to organize for environmental justice and for collective liberation. But most importantly, I could really hear through each of your individual stories, your love for your communities and love for transformation. So now what we're going to do as part of the next section for this panel is we're going to be doing a moderated Q&A. And so we already have drafted a question for each of the different panelists. And then after that, we're going to open it up for audience questions. But the first question is going to go to Jessica. So, Jessica, could you tell us more about your book, Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science? What is your vision of a future in which Western science can fix its mistakes, similar to your banana leaf analogy, and work with Indigenous science in harmony to give Indigenous people more autonomy over their lands and to be treated as prominent leaders in the fight against environmental injustices and climate change?
Yeah, thank you, Luz, for that question. So I think it's my book, Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science, is basically foregrounding the story of my father, who was an Indigenous child soldier during the Central American Civil War, or armed conflict, as is referred to in Guatemala, El Salvador. And as a result of that, right, we see how that Civil War was a disguise to commit a genocide against Indigenous peoples, especially as they were leading the land back movement throughout Central America. So I think that it foregrounds his story, coming of age as a child, and also the teachings uplifting Indigenous women's voices, because we often see how Indigenous women's voices are not uplifted, especially in the environmental discourse, climate justice discourse. And I think that as a scientist, right, kind of similar to Kendra's story, trained in the Western sciences, I have understood that conservation, it's a Western way of thinking, because we didn't need conservation before colonization impacted the Americas. And we see how conservation kind of puts our our landscapes into boxes where we're like, oh, we're going to save the elephants, but we don't look at the holistic ecosystem that our indigenous communities kind of look at everything, right? So it's kind of putting things into puzzle pieces and not necessarily looking at the entire puzzle completed. So I think that for indigenous science to be included, we need more indigenous peoples in the discussions, especially in national and international policies, because, you know, working for the International Mayan League, we see oftentimes that indigenous peoples are displaced, and yet their indigeneity is kind of erased within the United States frameworks when they hit, you know, the border, because they're often labeled as Latinx or Hispanic. And not everybody, you know, not saying that everybody from Latin America is indigenous, but there's an indigenous nation and affiliation that we have to keep in mind, so that the United Declaration of Indigenous Peoples and Rights, the UNDRIP, is actually classified within the immigration policy and discourses. So I think that, you know, it's a really broad question, but, you know, I welcome other panelists as well. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, Kendra, would you want to chime in also around that question?
Yeah, would you, sorry, I was preparing for the next question already. Going back to my notes.
I'll reshare it. So what is your vision of a future in which Western science can fix its mistakes, similar to an analogy that Jessica ended up sharing with us, and work with indigenous science and harmony to give indigenous people more autonomy over their lands and to be treated as prominent leaders in the fight against environmental injustices and climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much listening that needs to happen, which I think maybe, yeah, Jessica was saying too, that there's just like an imagination opening that needs to happen also in the scientific community in order to bring in more of these different worldviews. Like there's just such a bigger worldview shift, I think, that needs to happen. But I think that people are ready for it. Like I've noticed in academic environments, you know, young scientists are just as confused about like what is going on in society and in our personal lives and all these things, and are looking for answers, and they're looking for healing in different capacities. So I think that aspect of healing also that many that I think everybody here touched on in a real emotional capacity, in a heart-centered way, is a real good connective tissue to get into, to create those relationships between more Western communities and more indigenous or ancestral communities, because there's solutions there. They just like need to be tapped into, and there's healing there, you know, for all capacities, healing our environment, healing our minds, healing our relationships, and ourselves too.
Okay. Thank you, Kendra. And thank you so much for sharing with us earlier about your experience in program development focused on interdisciplinary STEM education and pedagogy, as well as community science and science communication. Can you inform the audience now of creative ways environmental justice educators can engage youth to increase environmental literacy?
Yeah, I think that in environmental justice teaching environmental justice is an opportunity to teach critical consciousness, this idea of like, how is each person an individual with an ability to observe the world around them and observe the interconnections of the world around them, you know? So it's a perfect sort of model to be like, well, what's happening out here in the world? We all know that something weird is happening, that things are not healthy out here. And like, what's happening in your own world? Like, do you feel like your world is healthy and that your patterns are healthy? And ways to start thinking about these connections. And so exploring those things too, I think it's important to not go too deep into the like doom and gloom aspect of things either, but exploring them through play is really important. Like, let's play some games and see how patterns exist in nature and how these interconnections, how, you know, you can play a lot of like embodied games where you create a chain and, you know, like you can do a human wave kind of thing, or you can create like a human graph where you ask the crowd different questions and you can map based on like, where does everybody live in the neighborhood, and you can see where everyone lives, or line up by what month were you born. And then you can also turn that from a line into a circle and start thinking about, how do scientists look at data? We're looking at information in these different ways, but we can do it in a more playful way, and to understand how these systems and these patterns emerge. And then the last thing is that it's a great opportunity to give, like, again, like hands-on projects where you can really do an experiment in a period of time where you're growing something or you're building a sensor, and you're learning about STEM skills. So you're learning science, technology, engineering, math, all those things, but you're doing it in a way where I think kids feel like they have a sense of ownership in helping, that they're actually like part of a solution in some kind of way, and have, again, that sense of responsibility that we all have a role to play here. And like, what's your role going to be? And how are you going to take what you're learning and implement it into this healing process that we're really trying to discover together, and sort of co-creating that process together, I think is important to highlight.
Brilliant.
Yeah, also I was going to say, Nat and Carla and Jessica, if you also wanted to chime in that question as to how youth leadership could also be really central to continuing to address environmental injustices in the work that you do. Because I know that, Jessica, you also might be working with youth, and also Nat and Carla, you might be working with youth. So maybe you both want to share also some answers alongside that question.
Yeah, so for me, like, I integrate a lot of place-based education because I think that it's important for students to not just learn these concepts, but also know how to apply it to their local environments. Like, for instance, Nat and Carla were mentioning how, there is the land restoration that's going on, but there's also that immigration and displacement, intersection that connects with that. So I think place-based education, which is an indigenous pedagogy and native education, kind of integrates that. Thank you.
Hey. Interestingly enough, in our community, it's the youth who usually has been very, they take initiative, if anything. At least for me, like, I'm very inspired by the youth here. And we do have a lot of them joining in our projects. Your sister, as a matter of fact, she's been part of our volunteer work at the border. And she tells us, like, there's these students who want to, like, partake in this. And we're working our way with that because they are minors. And but I don't know.
Definitely. Like Kendra said, we all have a role. Our roles right now we're the aunties. So we definitely are open. Our arms are wide open to, getting the kids involved any way we can. We have her daughter that's always with us as well, learning from us. We're learning from her more than anything. So it's a give and take as well.
Yeah, I also wanted to just quickly highlight the fact that, my sister has been able to volunteer with Nat and Carla, which is truly incredible. But Nat and Carla, I don't think I've ever personally have shared this, but after we did that border aid run, my sister ended up sharing with me how much she wanted to change her entire career to specifically work with asylum seekers. And so for her, she, of course, wanted to stay in the environmental justice field, but now she's like, all of this is interconnected. And I think my place in terms of where I want to support my community is here in my backyard, here in San Luis, Arizona. So I just wanted to let you all know that that moment was very transformative for my sister, and really you all played a huge role in her own transformation. And it did it really by just showing her and giving an opportunity to lead. So I just wanted to make sure that you all heard that story and just highlight the importance of what storytelling and reconnecting with our ancestral ways, the benefits of what that does to youth, and how we can be able to activate that transformation.
That's beautiful.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm tearing up right now.
Aunties.
We're so proud.
Yeah, you both really are tias, true aunties. And like, one of the things that I always hear from my sister is that you all have her back. And if that anything were to happen, that they can be able to reach out to you, whether it's through Signal, whether it's through Instagram. And I think that's something that is very much needed, especially in border towns where there's not many resources or capacity, especially with those who are being displaced by colonization and climate injustices. So to know that all of you are also doing this work on the front line is truly incredible. But I wanted to make sure that I shared that very small story, because again, it really shows how much you all have been activating transformation in our community.
That's so special. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That means the world to us. Thank you.
Well, getting to the next question is actually for Nat and Carla. So climate change is displacing many folks, as many of the presenters have talked about in today's panel, throughout the world, especially Black, Indigenous folks across Latin America and the Caribbean, due to stronger storms that then end up leading to flooding. How do you see mutual aid being used to support those displaced by climate injustices? And how has mutual aid supported your vision in envisioning a world rooted in liberation, such as abolishing borders, abolishing ICE? What does that look like for you? How has mutual aid supported you in that vision?
Thank you, Luz, for that question. To us, mutual aid is at the foundation and the core of what we do. You know, without it, we wouldn't be able to support the visions we have for an abolitionist future. We rely on one another, and like we previously stated, the safest communities is where we have the most resources.
Yeah, definitely. We just think that it's very important that we uplift one another and with mutual aid, where it's really been such a big part of what we do. Just having the community support us, it means so much to us, and it's always something that we're mindful of. We also want to give back as much as we can. So mutual aid is a huge factor of what we do. And I believe that in the future, mutual aid is the only thing that's going to get us through. It's the only way that with communities helping one another, that's the only way. That's the only structure that I see that's sustainable, because we've seen it. We've seen it the past 2 years. We wouldn't be able to do any of the work we do without mutual aid. So it's definitely a big part of it.
Yeah, and Jessica, I know that you also end up running mutual aid programs, and Kendra, you also end up doing the same. Would you like to share also how mutual aid has informed a lot of the work that you've done?
Yes, I think looking at climate change and the stronger storms, we often see how when there's this drastic measure that kind of impacts people's livelihoods, especially Indigenous peoples or peoples from where those communities don't have much resources, they're forced to be displaced. So, for instance, in Oaxaca, we have experienced a lot of stronger storms due to hurricanes, and as a result of that, it has killed off a lot of our harvest, which we refer to as milpas. So oftentimes, that is the only food source that our communities have. So when this is destroyed, a lot of our people have to either be internally displaced, where they have to leave our ancestral lands and go into cities to find a job, or they have to, seek the external displacement, which is, migration to the United States. And as a result of that, being able to support them through mutual aids, because, we have a lot of people Indigenous people from Oaxaca who are displaced, we're able to provide those opportunities to, use them to provide them with food sources and other kind of resources that they need during those drastic natural storms or other environmental disasters that are happening and being amplified because of climate change, to kind of prevent that displacement. Because oftentimes when we ask our people, did we ever want to leave our lands? Obviously the answer is no, right? Because we have a lot of ancestral knowledge and histories there, but we don't have a choice, right? So we often are forced from our lands. I think that through mutual aid, we're kind of liberating that narrative from having to be displaced or having to look for other cities, job opportunities that are very oppressive towards our people, because often in Mexico and other locations throughout Latin America, there's a lot of anti-Indigenous discrimination and racism that we're subjected to. So I think that with mutual aid, it kind of creates a community even from the diaspora.
Yeah, and I can add to that too. I was super inspired by the mutual aid movement in New York City that happened during the early days of the pandemic, when New York City really shut down, and it was like one of the few places where some people could get food or resources. And I started to think about how we could activate many of these community spaces as sort of like first responding tech spaces as well, in terms of both monitoring and also deploying of resources, so, and education as well. So, what we've now done is we're piloting this program where we work with people within the community space, train them on the technology, then they get to decide where they're going to install these monitoring systems so that they are then the hub where the knowledge is held with the people in the community in both the technology and knowing how the sensors work and being able to maintenance them, and then being able to be like the first line of signal to say like something's happening in the community, there's information, there's data, we can use that to advocate for more different legislation, or in the terms of the flood sensors, also to know where flooding is happening in different neighborhoods as a safety feature. And then in terms of education, I do agree with Nat and Carla on like that for the future, like mutual aid, that in these hyper local communities is where even education, I think, is going to proliferate as well. Like we need to learn how to teach each other and how to teach other people how to teach people, and to see that again, part of that, what is everybody's role is to share what their gifts is with the community. And so I think that if we're starting to as we teach, and part of that is teaching others, we're going to be able to amplify knowledge more in those kinds of ways.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. So we are at 3:45. So we want to give folks in the audience an opportunity to also ask questions. So I'm going to quickly check the comment box to see if there's any questions. I don't see any at the moment. But to close this off, I know for me, I think it's very important that especially those who are organizing for environmental justice and liberation take care of themselves and celebrate themselves and find ways to be able to be in community, which all of you have highlighted throughout all your presentations. But I would love to hear from each of you, how are you finding joy and love during these times? How are you making sure that you're connecting to community? And how, as Kendra has mentioned, how do you approach things through a heart-centered approach to taking care of yourself? So I'm going to first start with Kendra, and then Jessica, and then Nat and Carla.
Oh, what a question. Yeah, I mean, it's hard these days, right? That's why I put in that slide, like staying with the trouble, because it's just like, it's even when things are going okay, there's still such a heaviness. I feel like that. I know personally, I've been trying to unpack, like, why do things still, I mean, it's obvious, but also, and I think for me, like creating a like home environment is really important, as foundation, like finding a center place so that I'm rooted in a way that I can have a greater capacity for more unsteadiness, in whatever ways that I'm working outside of that. And then just allowing myself to spend more time just like talking to people and chatting and like having conversations that meander, or in our workspaces that just allow for, like, you never know what kind of anecdotes or like tender conversations get to emerge when you just allow that space and not always have to have an agenda that's like, we need to meet me. And you see, again, you have to find the balance between it, but trying to do that, and also to be creative and create art as much as possible. Thank you.
So for me, a way I do that is like reclaiming my relationship with writing, because oftentimes, when you go into school, writing kind of becomes a chore where you have to write a certain way. So reclaiming that writing, kind of integrating oral storytelling so that, we can reclaim writing, right? Because it's even though there's this misconception that a lot of Indigenous communities didn't have a writing system, we did, right? But obviously it wasn't English. It wasn't the way that it's now today. And also just being with nature, tending to the gardens, to other natural resources, animals. I love animals. So being able to do that while at home, that's the way I, center myself. Thank you.
Well, for me, I mean, it goes without saying, I'm a mother, and of course I want to like pave these spaces for like our children and the future generations. And I find the love in my community, like finding like-minded people. And another thing, I mean, we're in the front lines of the border, and it's very, very emotionally, what's the word? Like we definitely need to take some time to ourselves. We have to have radical tenderness to ourselves and to our peers. And that's why it's our priority, And there's a quote by Kava that says, hope is discipline. We definitely have to put hope into practice, because it's very easy, especially with our current nature of like everything that's happening in society. But like we have to like practice hope, and we have each other to rely on. That's why community is very important, because sometimes we need to take a break, and the community keeps the work going, you know, and it's beautiful and very necessary and essential.
Yeah, that's right. I'm just like Carla. I find a lot of joy in seeing children. I have a nephew who is 13 months old, and I'm always thinking about how he sees the world and just taking that into consideration and, you know, adapting it to how I see the world, you know, with wonder, you know. And I find joy and love in being with my family, being with my friends, being at the border. It can be draining, but I find so much joy in being able to be helpful to others and give others what they need, their most essential. And I just think that being in joy with others, you know, laughing, crying with others, it's always important. It's something that brings me a lot of joy. So things like that bring me a lot of joy. Being with my animals too.
Plantitas.
Our plantitas, yes. So
nature, yeah,
being with nature, yes. It's raining in Yuma right now, which never happens.
Surprisingly.
So, you know, I'm gonna be out there in the rain therapy, doing my rain therapy. So it's just really important for us to find space for joy. And sometimes that means disconnecting, you know. Sometimes you got to disconnect and just kind of take time to yourself, and have solidarity with yourself as well.
Yeah, everything you all said was so beautifully said. And honestly, even just being part of this panel brought me so much joy and enthusiasm and hope as to where we're going in the future. So I think, again, it was really a pleasure to have all of you be able to present on the work that you're doing, to giving us hope, to giving us optimism as to how does it look like for us to do liberation science with the goal of addressing environmental injustices and working towards collective liberation. So I thank you all again so much for participating in today's panel. And hopefully we'll be seeing each other soon. But thank you all so much. Have a good one. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.